Okay, welcome back to the discussion of the biology of Kundalini by Jana Dixon. We stopped yesterday right after talking about her left brain freeze when she was having her awakening. So then we only read like just the very beginning of that. So I just want to back up. She said she was having the left brain freeze as one of the first radical symptoms to arrive before anything else happened for her. And remember yesterday, the numbing and freezing can come from the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems, both going into hyperactivity at the same time, and they can freeze each other out. She was experiencing that in the left brain. She says, since the neuroinhibiting clamp only occurs on the left side of the brain, this is another factor leading to the conclusion that the overexcitation of nerves by Kundalini energy mostly occurs in the left brain hemisphere and left side of the body. And then she's like, although why, I don't know why this is, even though she just said that the neuroinhibiting clamp occurs on that side. I don't know. Anyway, she said, I assume this numbing clamp was due to the neuroinhibitors GABA, glycine, and endorphins. In the Google video by Robert Sapolsky, Stress, Neurodegeneration, and Individual Differences, he said, the neuronal defenses against overexcitation by glutamate include substances such as adenosine, GABA, and taurine. The neuroinhibitor adenosine plays an important role in biochemical processes such as energy transfer, as ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, and ADP, as well as in signal transduction as cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP. Caffeine similatory effects are primarily, although not entirely, credited to its inhibition of adenosine by binding to the same receptors. So that which stimulates caffeine does the same as this neuroinhibitor adenosine. It blocks the adenosine. By blocking the adenosine receptors, caffeine, on the other hand, is a vasoconstrictor. 250 milligrams of caffeine can decrease central blood flow by 20 to 30%. With the information currently available, we can assume that the left brain freeze is caused both by vasodilation and neuroinhibition. Both. With the left brain freeze, we can see that the left eyelid is droopy, the pupil is dilated, and a strange new consciousness is apparent in the eye itself. During sun meditation, she says, as I looked at the sun, I found my left eyelid was lit red from the increased blood supply due to the dilated blood vessels. Eyelids are closed during sun meditation. She says it's actually not good to look at the sun, and for further reference on that, you can see my online articles about sun gazing, where I talk about when it is okay to look at the sun. You can find that on the Guardian Liberty Voice, searching my name and sun gazing. Understanding the experience of the red eyelid capped off my entire investigation. For once I understood the presence of increased nitric oxide during Kundalini and started reading about the freeze response, I realized that the paralysis in the left brain freeze and the red eyelid were not accompanied by the contraction of tissues, but by their dilation. Even if the numbing, pressurized clamping effect feels like it's in a contraction. So she's saying it's actually dilated. That numbing feeling is actually being wide open. Hi, kitty. And that the paralysis during the inner conjunction may not be due to overstimulation of the motor sensory cortex, but due to the freeze response that operates on the brainstem and the dorsal vagus complex. The neurological cause of the numbness is either of the hemispheres is probably rather simply explained. Since most of the electrical activity in Kundalini is experienced on the left body, left brain, I assume the numbing of the scalp on the left side of the head is simply a result of massive beta endorphins, or opiates, production in an effort to inhibit the excessive nerve firing on the left side of the brain. So just extra endorphins from the body trying to protect itself. This left brain crab gives new meaning to the term numbskull. Funny. Doing mathematics in the head is almost impossible during this state. One has to watch out that one doesn't do silly things, or rather one watches oneself do silly things. I can relate. The effect of having the left brain function suspended results in the body-soul claiming its own time and space for metamorphosis to occur. So there is sort of like a letting go, and she means silliness, like you're letting go of rules a little bit and structure a little bit because you're in that vasodilation from the Kundalini experience, and it's for your metamorphosis. The ego in one's life becomes subordinate to the metamorphic crisis as it totally takes over one's existence. With these awesome forces, the ego soon learns that it is not in the driver's seat. That is the Kundalini that is living us. The numbing effect of the left brain freeze can reach such acute proportions that I was reduced to a radically right brain consciousness on the day I met Mr. Universal. And I've actually heard a neurosurgeon, I can't remember her name, that had a stroke also, where she had left brain paralysis. She had a very similar state. It's so interesting to note the similarities in this Kundalini experience and her stroke experience. It makes me wonder. On that day, my left brain freeze reached its zenith, and right brain consciousness became more prominent in general during the entire period of the awakening. This also happens in like a plant medicine induced awakening too. You lose a lot of that left brain structure stuff. The night after leaving my initiator's presence, I had the most ecstatic divine experience of my life. I had lapsed into paralysis, rapturous trance as soon as I'd gone to bed. Although time is incalculable during such events, it seemed like perhaps for half an hour or more, a blissful electric, she says, penis was entering me. She was feeling penetrated by the cosmos. While ecstatic energy poured upward through every cell of my body. I call this experience sex with Eros. It wasn't anything I did, and it only happened once. Sex on that level is not sex, she said. It's some kind of God communion activity of the cells. She says, I felt like Jesus Christ after the first awakening in 1988, but with this sex with Eros thing, I was God, his very self, and she was a woman. Thus, I like to say that sex with Eros was the best sex I never had. Sex with Eros involves spontaneous, prolonged, full-body orgasm during an inner conjunction without a partner or any stimulation. However, orgasm, she says, in no way describes the sense of divinity and absolute unity that occurs. So she immediately, the energy of that wants to like contract to our societal conditioning. I could even feel it coming in through the video. And she is, excuse me, I've got a little runny nose. She's really like saying how completely ecstatic this was. This awakening was akin to making love to God and feeling like the child of that union at the same time. She says it might even correspond to the idea of being impregnated by God and consequently the virgin birth. Truly that sort of a communion and having like the virgin birth, like the new person be born in you. Stimulation of these contractions is probably due to a combination of vasopressin, oxytocin, prostaglandins, nitric oxide, and histamine within the context of generally upgraded sex hormones that occurs during the heating and peak Kundalini stages. So not only are you accessing tons more of your regular sex hormones, but all of these other systems are dilated and pumping oxytocin, prostaglandins, like feel good things, and it like makes you go into an extremely expansive state, very blissful. As night follows day, the morning after this complete opening, I woke to find myself in its opposite. So she describes this before. We already read this great high when meeting universal, and then this low so that she could integrate, right? A massive autonomic shock that she calls the white shock. So that's the involuntary contraction of the body. And she says the skin turns white as adrenaline causes blood to leave the surface tissues and into vasodilation of the skeletal muscles to be ready for action. My face was white, my hair stuck out like I'd been electrocuted, and my intestines, liver, spleen, and other viscera curled up and were fiercely contracted for days. Motor control was greatly impaired, and the freeze response, endorphin numbing, and possible nitric oxide damage leaves us with the disassociated feeling of not being in our body. She says, in fact, I was so disembodied that morning that I had a Hakomi session, which is a body-centered psychotherapy, to try to put herself back in her body. Says the Hakomi exercises worked to a degree, at least to help me feel less like a car crash victim or disassociated robot. I mean, car crashes can initiate a Kundalini awakening too, because I'm completely relating what she's saying after I was in a severe head-on collision and the shock from that. I don't know why I have to say this every time it happens, but the other guy died. Every time I share that, I feel like I have to share him because he was participant in that very extreme shock, like a white shock to my body, that I do feel was part of my awakening journey also. After any such autonomic shock, it's imperative to shake, dance, run, or push against walls with arms. Not after the car accident, but after a Kundalini autonomic shock. Shake, like you want to like shake it out, push on the wall, like make expressive noises, to eliminate stored tension of that freeze response, because it was like, holy moly, and then the body is just like, it's like someone really stretching a muscle and then not like slowly letting go, but letting go really fast. The muscle will actually have a cramp, pull up if you don't gently release it. So that Kundalini awakening opens everything really fast, but it can also drop quickly and cause that response. Your body's not fully integrated yet. Dr. Robert Scarra's book, The Trauma Spectrum, is a great source of information on the freeze response, trauma, and PTSD. So she gives the link to that. Dr. Robert Scaer, S-C-A-E-R. The Trauma Spectrum is his book. So she says you can look that up on, he has some kind of trauma-pages.com, something like that. After this radical expansion and contraction, the full conflagration of Kundalini heat came on, along with intense heat pressure and mystic ecstasies. My left brain continued to be so contracted that my left scalp, extending into the face and neck, was radically numb. So this whole area, the numbness becoming more prominent when the flow of Kundalini increased during its monthly progressions. I didn't experience a lot of pain, but I did have discomfort and intolerance for the overpowering intensity of the energy. Of course, going with it rather than resisting or running from it is the answer. To breathe into it and raise the energy without fear. So you can feel where the tension is, and if you can put your attention there, breathe and move your attention upward like you want to spread that energy out, then that can be really helpful. Philip St. Romain, in the book Kundalini Energy and Christian Spirituality, says his Kundalini symptoms of the crab, the pincers, and sword on his head became more painful when he deviated from spiritual alignment into various things like TV, reading, writing, certain foods, etc. This pain kept him on track to more fully enter his surrender. Philip St. Romain attributed great significance in the tucking in of his chin to facilitate the free flow of energy between the body and head, because you have a yogic lock there that opens up that channel. And thought his symptoms of the crab was due to not practicing this headlock during prayer. Interesting. He assumed the crab effect was the result of pressurized cerebral spinal fluid in the ventricles. Since the left brain freeze always occurs along with radical heart expansion, the numbness might be related to the vasodilators, histamine, nitric oxide, serotonin, acetylcholine. So whatever it is, it must be pretty substantial chemistry to exist for more than 3 years at varying intensity. Now, remember we talked about the other day, that can change because we're in a different part of the novelty spiral, right? Things are occurring closer together. Could the lowered blood pressure caused by the expanded vessels create this numbness, and why only on the left side if the effect is neurotransmitter based? The numbness actually occurs along with what feels like pretty intense head pressure, especially in prefrontal lobes. The logical answer is that numbness is endorphin based, but then again, why only on the left side of the brain? The phenomena of the left brain freeze points to the pivotal conjunction between the immune system, cardio, and nervous system. Pivotal conjunction between these three: immune, cardio, nervous system. She says nitric oxide is used by all these systems, and its heightened production during metamorphosis leads to both a cascade of major changes through the body and to many of the classic Kundalini symptoms. Okay? The fact that nitric oxide is a free radical gas explains why half the metamorphic process is about dissolving the old structure, and is one of the main reasons why normal operation of ego function is suspended, because of the dissolving of the old structures. Ego wouldn't have for it, right? Ego protects the old structures. While catabolism and cell death is underway, we are not our old self. This is a really good point. And we can see this too in people that are labeled with mental illness, that they're not being themselves, and that can perpetuate if there is an issue that's not being addressed. As we can see, there can be a flood of these different hormones for years, okay? If one is not versed in what that might look like, then you could be like, hey, Johnny's not himself anymore. He hasn't been for years. But instead of validating the experience as being part of his awakening process, if we try to stick it in other pockets or bags or containers or file folders and say, this is what it is, because we can't handle seeing a person not be themselves for very long. Of course, everyone's always going through some sort of metamorphosis, so we have to be willing to let go of their old self to see who is trying to emerge. And remember, it's a protective mechanism that this ego death occurs, and that can sometimes just mean they don't even identify with themselves as self anymore. There can be a detachment from the old personality. And that is like cell death also. Initially, I thought the left brain freeze, the crab, was due to the increase in heart electromagnetic field, because the heart expansion is such an overarching, omnipotent effect. But another cause could be related to initiation of spleen and special immune activity from the hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system during acute phases of awakening, in which case histamine would factor into the mix. The left brain numbness and contraction probably starts at the same time the spleen contracts, releasing its store of blood. Thus, the spleen, bone marrow, and immune system reboot to change from normal functions to a metamorphic mode in order to break down and dissolve the pupal body. It could be as long as the spleen is functioning in its metamorphic capacity that there may be some left brain freeze. If indeed the spleen and macrophages are set into hyperdrive by the oscillating on-off of the nervous system, remember, when they both are activating at the same time, they're like relaxing, contracting, there's an on-off kind of thing, and that's what can cause the freeze. So if they're set to hyperdrive by this oscillation, then the white blood cells would be producing a lot of nitric oxide. just a lot of free radicals. And this liberal dosing of vasodilators would keep the hyperactivation of the nervous system going, coupled with radically increased heart expansion and associated amplified heart electromagnetic field. Within the heightened heart field, the entire body would be dissolved and reformed in alignment with the higher template of the expanded heart. Literally, that means a breakdown of all the old cells and replaced by a new cell. So there is some sort of disassociation while that's going on. The end result of the effect of sustained heart expansion over many years results in the dissolving of body armor and traumatic memory in the brain. Okay, so it is a healing process that the body armor is being taken down and traumatic memories that are stored in the brain and other tissues are being removed, thus reducing neurosis, tension, and body pain. That is, if some new traumas are not introduced during this process, which can complicate it. During the fight-flight, first, the inflammatory response is activated. Then, when acute danger is over, the immune system is activated. This stimulates the spleen to contract, releasing much of its blood into circulation, as well as the liberation of glycogen stores from the liver, or glycogen, from the liver. It seems that all the visceral organs go into a major contraction at the onset of acute Kundalini phase in preparation for the shift to the self-dissolution work. So this massive influx comes and then this contraction, and it's almost like all the organs know that means they have to dissolve the old to create the new, that they already know what phase they're in. Thus, blood leaves the spleen, liver, digestive system, travels to the skeletal muscles to prepare the organism for action in the face of danger and possible injury, right? That's the metamorphosis. At this point, histamine metabolism in the bone marrow probably sets off the mechanism of using energy stored in the calcium bonds in the bones. This provides extra energy for Kundalini conflagration and produces heat, which seems to penetrate down to the bone. That's often what people are saying about their Kundalini heat, is down to the bone. The acute phase of Kundalini seems to largely consist of both fight or flight response and freeze response. That is, the body is in a state of hypervigilance, the go mode, coupled with freeze, the stop mode. And this burns a lot of energy without any real work being done, right? Thus, we can lose a lot of weight this way. So that can happen. I know sometimes I've fluctuated. Some people have thought I'm super small, too small or sick or something during some of my Kundalini phases, because I'm like, my metabolism goes so high as things are burning out and I just can't keep up with it. People often report weight loss during the first awakening, especially and consistently, when this radical shock is more in effect than in later awakenings. Remember, this shock is autonomic. We have no control over it, except perhaps if we are an advanced yogi. The brain is a hologram of the body, so the condition of various tissues throughout the body is reflected in the nature of the brain. An occluded dead pelvis, for instance, would have a corresponding occlusion and deficiency in the brain structure and chemistry. Thus, when we have Kundalini moving through the pelvis, it is simultaneously moving through a particular pathway in the brain. The end result of this chemistry seems to be an unlocking of connective tissues, loosening the entire body armor, and a reduction of pain in the pain body. Kriyas are seizure-type impulses related to certain neurotransmitters and areas in the brain. Traditionally, it was thought kriyas were purifying movements or cleansing actions, revealing blocks in the flow of Kundalini. They say yoga arose through observing the various spontaneously arising positions, or asanas, created by kriyas. So when that impulse is going and the body's doing certain things, like it would cause a pose to happen. She says, I think this might partly be the case whether a voluntary complying with the way the energy wants to go or an involuntary compulsory asana. It was assumed that kriyas, or the spontaneous convulsions and contorted movements produced by Kundalini, are stress being released in order to unblock and restructure the tissue to convey greater consciousness. However, Kriyas are best explained in terms of neurochemistry, such as the overexcitation or disinhibition of the body's glycine and GABA producing neurons in the brain centers that coordinate movement. So overexciting and then no inhibition. So the coordinated movements, they're not inhibited anymore. They are excited and they don't care. So the nervous system is all go and the inhibiting off switch is incapacitated. I think they're probably convulsive discharges of the letting go of the freeze response and from spontaneous firing through the motor area of the brain. The convulsions are more likely to be the result of kindling type brain chemistry that perpetuates itself and slowly changes nerves, brain, and cells until the whole body is transformed into a higher rev state. So it's purposeful, it's like transforming the body, it's continuing to send messages, but in the interim it could seem really like disjointed and strange. She says Kriyas might be painful with spontaneous contraction of muscles. Not the kind of Kriya she's talking about. I practice the Kriya yoga, it's not the same. She's talking about like actions. Kriyas are actions also that are spontaneous and sort of like glitchy sort of things. She's talking about spontaneous muscle contractions. She says not everyone has these. Mostly Kundalini is not associated with pain because of the extreme levels of opiates that are produced. Traditionally, the spinal knots that Kundalini penetrates are called granthis, and there's three main granthis: the throat, the navel, and the base. In East, they say the root chakra, heart, and third chakras are the greatest obstacle to the rise of Kundalini. However, the process is not linear and it moves with the seasons, returning again and again to the same spot to work at deeper levels each time. So if you do have a knot in the heart, your Kundalini comes through and it visits it for a time, and then it comes back, and then it goes again, you know. During acutely active Kundalini, it feels more like there's a white light flowing inside the body and illuminating the world, a pervading sense of white, even though one cannot actually see it as white. So it just feels like it, like we see white with our whole body. This sense of whiteness may be due to a general increase in nerve action potential and the increased ionization of cerebral spinal fluid. Literally tons of ions in your spine, like being at the ocean, and you get like sort of this misty, hazy, like magical feeling if you live in that kind of setting. Visual acuity, transcendental vision, goes up in the heating and peak phases of Kundalini due to stimulation of occipital lobe, where the visual cortex lies, and to increase pituitary hormones, nitric oxide, histamine, phenylethylamine, dopamine, norepinephrine, and increase blood flow to the brain. Wow. Color becomes more saturated. I definitely had that in my Kundalini experience when I was in India on the beach. Increased biophotons generated in the brain. Because transcendental vision is very much like being on the drug ecstasy, if you've ever tried that, MDMA, which is a dopamine drug, I suspect that it is phenylethylamine and dopamine that gives us the radical shift in vision, as though every atom were scintillating and super alive. And she says, i.e., the eyes of love. Well, that is how you can see sometimes in these states. Whatever the neurotransmitter mix, one can assume the increased energy passing through the optic center in the brain leads to scintillating transcendental vision. Kundalini, as a general rule, is not hallucinogenic, although there is a high level of opiates being produced. Entheogens are substances which generate God or spirit within producing states of shamanic, ecstatic, possession, she says, and transcendent and beatific states of communion with deity. Endogenous entheogens that the body produces are probably the agents for visions and deep spiritual experiences. So the body does create its own entheogen, which would be DMT. She does talk about that in here somewhere. The visual experiences involved are more dreamlike than the extreme psychedelia inspired by drugs. The increase in psi and telepathy is harder to explain, but is probably something equally as simple as non-local primary perception or the increased superconduction of consciousness. The EMF of the human body is greatly magnified during Kundalini, and the brain might be able to pick up the radio signal of a significant other, so to speak, like you're putting your vibes out, your brain waves. The other alternative is that consciousness doesn't travel in any kind of wave, but that it's non-local phenomena. But I think we need new physics to explain that one, she says, especially as it relates to precognition. Psychic and bioenergetic phenomena doesn't particularly mean anything other than the meaning we give it. Psi, PSI, subtle and causal effects are simply a revelation or confirmation of the way the universe is put together. However, because it is extrasensory and transcends mind, we tend to think that it is more important than the consensus reality that is based on cognitive interpretation of information from the five senses. Because material flatland is so painful and in its superficiality, lacks meaning and dire lack of connection, we are beset with deep intrinsic need, desire, and passion for spiritual experience. Just because something is beyond the five senses, we often think it has greater holy significance, and we tend to be drawn hither and thither by our spiritual ambition to get more God. She says, remember, only 1% of our consciousness is conscious. That means there's a lot going on that we never know about. The larger mind likes to remind us of its presence, and so it feeds us precognitive and psychic tidbits, synchronicity and psi information in dreams. Such siddhas don't really mean much other than there being an intrinsic example of Kundalini energy and a reminder of the non-local and unusual properties of consciousness itself. Like my ability to tune my stereo radio CD player on at 3 a.m. in the morning during particularly rarefied holy energy states of Kundalini sleep. It happened twice recently, but mostly in 2000, perhaps 10 times altogether. She says, I think it could only happen in summer when bioenergy is higher. So there's no miscalculation with daylight savings. As metamorphosis precedes, the ultimate outcome of Kundalini awakenings is a reduction in background fear, body armor, and emotional volatility. The various symptoms are slightly different in each person, but they don't mean anything in themselves other than as signs that the body-mind is transforming and fuller powers are being realized. Okay, you guys, we're going to stop for today. Tomorrow we get into the immune system and transmutation. So some of this is intense biology, right? A lot of terms to know, and some of it might just go through you this first time and you might not make a connection. I've read this lots of times, and sometimes like a new part just really sticks out at me and other stuff goes through and vice versa. So I hope you're enjoying the read. Remember, you can follow along, get your own copy of Jana Dixon's The Biology of Kundalini, Exploring the Fire of Life, or you can go to lulu.com and read it for free and cross-reference stuff and all that. If you like this video, if you like these readings, please like this video down below. Share the series with somebody that you love, and we'll see you next time.